Julie Andrews was once the clearest voice in Hollywood, a sound so pure it felt untouchable. Mary Poppins, the sound of music, her name became synonymous with perfection. To audiences she was ageless, flawless, and eternal. But behind the standing ovations, her story turned darker. She lost the very gift that defined her. She endured heartbreak in her marriage, struggles within her family, and private battles that nearly shattered the image fans believed was unshakable. At 90, her story is not only one of triumph, it is one of devastating loss. So how did the brightest star of the 1960s come to carry such tragedy in her later years? What was taken from her that she could never recover? And why, even now, does her journey leave fans heartbroken? Julie Andrews' story, for most of the world, begins in the golden glow of the 1960s. By then she had already spent years building her reputation on stage, but cinema was where she became untouchable. In 1964, when Walt Disney chose her to play Mary Poppins, it wasn't just a casting, it was the creation of an icon. She floated onto the screen with an elegance that blended magic, warmth, and humor, all wrapped around a voice that critics described as crystalline. Audiences didn't simply watch Mary Poppins, they believed in her. The role won her an Academy Award, and overnight, Julie Andrews was no longer just a rising star, she was the voice of an era. Her triumph did not stop there. Just a year later came The Sound of Music. As Maria von Trapp, she carried the weight of a story that could easily have become overly sentimental. Instead, she gave it soul. Her voice soared over the hills of Austria and into the hearts of millions. The film became one of the most successful in cinematic history, and Julie was placed on a pedestal few performers could ever reach. She wasn't just an actress or a singer. She was a cultural figure, a symbol of innocence, joy, and possibility. But that pedestal came at a price. To Hollywood executives and to the public, Julie Andrews became defined by a singular type of character, the angelic governess, the wholesome heroine, the woman whose voice could lift spirits without flaw. It was a blessing and a curse. The praise was endless, but it left little room for her to grow. Every role was compared to Maria or Mary Poppins. The same perfection fans adored also became a cage she could not easily escape. Even in her golden years, cracks began to show. In the later half of the 1960s, as she experimented with other roles, audiences hesitated to embrace her outside of the wholesome image they had fixed in their minds. Films that should have expanded her career struggled at the box office. Projects like Star and Darling Lily, lavish productions meant to showcase her range, were considered disappointments. The press began to speculate. Had Julie Andrews already peaked? Could she ever match the staggering heights of her earliest successes? Yet through it all, her dignity never wavered. She smiled through interviews, carried herself with grace, and insisted on finding roles that would challenge her. But behind the curtain, she felt the weight of being trapped by her own success. She had become one of the most beloved stars in the world, yet she was slowly learning that fame could be a prison, and public adoration could just as easily turn into criticism. What no one could have imagined at the time was that the struggles she faced with typecasting and failed projects would pale in comparison to the tragedy that lay ahead. The losses she would endure later in her career and in her personal life would not just shake her image, they would break her heart in ways that even her closest admirers could never have prepared for. After the dizzying success of Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, Hollywood rushed to capitalize on Julie Andrews' image. Studio executives saw not the woman but the archetype, the proper English lady with a heavenly voice and unshakable goodness. She was cast in musicals and family-friendly roles again and again, each one attempting to recapture the lightning of her earlier triumphs. But by the late 1960s, the tide of entertainment was shifting. The public was changing. America was entering a new cultural era defined by rebellion, grit, and realism. The gentle, wholesome world that Julie embodied so perfectly suddenly felt out of step with the times. Audiences wanted anti-heroes, social commentary, and boundary-pushing films. And so the very qualities that once made her indispensable now left her vulnerable. The first warning sign came with Star, in 1968, a lavish biographical musical about Gertrude Lawrence. The film was meant to cement Julie's status as a serious, bankable star outside of her established roles. Instead, it flopped. Critics called it overindulgent, audiences stayed away, and the press speculated that Julie's golden touch was fading. Then came Darling Lily, in 1970, a World War I musical spy film co-starring Rock Hudson. Directed by her husband Blake Edwards, it was a deeply personal project. But after endless rewrites, spiraling budgets, and a disastrous reception, it too collapsed at the box office. For Julie, these failures cut deeply. They weren't just career setbacks, they were public rejections. Every headline seemed to suggest the same cruel question: had Julie Andrews become irrelevant? The truth was more complicated. She remained one of the most talented actresses in the business. But Hollywood was no longer interested in what she represented. The studios wanted new faces, edgier stars, and stories that reflected a turbulent era. Julie, who had once been the very definition of box office success, suddenly found herself without control over her own career. And yet, she didn't give up. She turned to projects that allowed her to reinvent herself. In 1982, she starred in Victorious Victoria, directed again by Blake Edwards. The role was daring, a woman pretending to be a man who impersonates a woman. It was risky, playful, and groundbreaking for its time. The film was a triumph, earning her an Academy Award nomination and proving that she could thrive outside of her wholesome image. For a moment it seemed as though Julie had reclaimed her place at the top. But even that success carried an edge of uncertainty. Hollywood still didn't know what to do with her. She was too talented to ignore, too iconic to reinvent, and yet too tied to the past to fit easily into the present. She had fought her way back, but the industry's love affair with her was no longer secure. What Julie could not have predicted was that her greatest tragedy was not waiting on a studio lot or in a box office report. It would come not from a role, but from her own body. At the height of her reinvention, when she was ready to explore a new chapter, one devastating medical procedure would steal from her the very gift that had carried her to the top, and with it, a piece of her soul. For decades, Julie Andrews's voice was not just her trademark, it was her very identity. It was the crystalline soprano that lifted the sound of music into the stratosphere, the gentle lilt that made Mary Poppins unforgettable, the sound that critics described as pure, effortless, and eternal. Fans assumed it would never fade, but in 1997, everything changed. That year, Julie went in for what was supposed to be a routine surgery. She had developed non-cancerous nodules on her vocal cords, a condition common among singers and treatable with the right care. Doctors assured her it would be a simple procedure, a minor interruption in a career that still had years ahead of it. She trusted them, as anyone would. But when the surgery was complete, Julie awoke to discover that her voice, the very gift that had defined her life, was gone. The damage was catastrophic. Instead of removing the nodules, the procedure had permanently scarred her vocal cords. Her once effortless range was reduced to a strained whisper. The singer who had soared over orchestras and filled theaters with brilliance could no longer perform the simplest of songs. Overnight, the sound that had enchanted the world for 4 decades was silenced. The loss was more than professional. It was deeply personal, a blow to her very sense of self. For Julie, singing wasn't just a career, it was a way of being, an expression of joy, pain, and love. To have it stripped away so suddenly felt like an amputation. Friends later recalled how devastated she was, how she grieved not just the end of concerts or albums, but the disappearance of something woven into her soul. The aftermath was a storm. Julie and her family pursued legal action against the doctors who had performed the surgery, claiming malpractice. The lawsuit dragged on for years, placing her most private pain in public headlines. Eventually, it was settled out of court, but no amount of compensation could restore what she had lost. The public saw her smile in interviews, but those close to her knew the truth. Her heart was broken. Yet even in her grief, Julie refused to disappear. She reinvented herself as an actress without song, taking on dramatic roles that relied on her poise and presence rather than her voice. She leaned into narration and voice acting, where her speaking voice, though changed, still carried authority and grace. She began writing children's books with her daughter, finding new ways to share her creativity. But nothing could erase the shadow of that tragedy. For fans who had grown up with her songs, it was unthinkable. The woman who had embodied music itself could no longer sing. For Julie, it was a wound that never fully healed, a reminder of how fragile even the brightest gifts can be. The tragedy of losing her voice marked a turning point. From that moment on, every triumph was measured against a loss she could never undo. And while she carried herself with resilience, her journey was no longer the story of a star shining effortlessly. It was the story of a woman surviving heartbreak. If losing her voice was the most visible tragedy of Julie Andrews's life, the private struggles within her family carried an even heavier weight. Behind the grace and composure she showed in public, Julie endured heartbreaks that tested her resilience far beyond the stage or screen. Her marriage to filmmaker Blake Edwards was in many ways the cornerstone of her adult life. They married in 1969, both already established in Hollywood, both bringing children from previous marriages into the union. Together they raised a blended family, eventually adopting 2 daughters from Vietnam in the early 1970s. For decades, Julie spoke of how much joy her children gave her, how motherhood grounded her amid the chaos of fame. To the outside world, the Andrews-Edwards household appeared filled with laughter, creativity, and stability. But like any family, theirs carried shadows. Blake Edwards struggled with long periods of depression and chronic illness. His moods could swing, his health could decline suddenly, and Julie often found herself not only as wife and partner, but as caretaker and anchor. For someone who had already been carrying the crushing expectations of a global audience, the weight of holding a family together through such challenges could be overwhelming. She rarely spoke publicly about the depth of those struggles, but friends noted her quiet endurance, her refusal to walk away even in the hardest times. The adoption of her daughters was a decision filled with love, yet it also came with challenges. Raising children from a war-torn country, integrating them into a family already under a media spotlight, required patience and understanding. Julie embraced the responsibility wholeheartedly, but it was another layer of emotional labor added to an already demanding life. She wanted to give them stability, even while her own world was shaken by career setbacks and the loss of her singing voice. Then came the greatest personal blow. In 2010, Blake Edwards passed away after 41 years of marriage. Julie had often called him the love of her life, her partner, not only in work but in everything that gave her strength. His death left a silence no applause could fill. For decades she had leaned on him through triumphs and tragedies alike. Without him, she faced the later chapters of her life with a loneliness she rarely admitted publicly. Even within her extended family, difficulties arose. Fame has a way of distorting relationships, and Julie's children sometimes struggled under the shadow of her name. The burden of being Julie Andrews's daughter or Blake Edwards's child was one they never asked for, yet could never escape. Those tensions, combined with grief and the pressures of public life, left Julie carrying more heartache than fans could ever imagine. And yet, through it all, she remained the figure the world adored, gracious, poised, and endlessly dignified. The tragedies within her home, the losses that cut the deepest, rarely made headlines, but they shaped her more than any film role ever could. Julie Andrews has often been described as timeless, but her personal life was marked by the same fragility that touches us all. She survived the collapse of her voice. She survived the scrutiny of Hollywood. She survived the loss of the man she loved most. And at 90, the private pain of those struggles lingers, even beneath the smile she still offers the world. For many, the tragedy of Julie Andrews' story might seem overwhelming, losing her voice, enduring the struggles of family life, and facing widowhood after decades of marriage. Yet what makes her journey remarkable is not only the heartbreak she carried, but the resilience with which she faced it. When her singing voice was taken from her, Julie might have retreated into silence. Instead, she found new ways to express herself. Partnering with her daughter Emma Walton Hamilton, she began writing children's books. Their stories, filled with imagination and kindness, introduced Julie's creativity to a new generation. For a woman who had once defined herself through song, the act of storytelling became a lifeline. It allowed her to remain connected to children and families, not through melodies, but through words that carried her same warmth. She also embraced voice work, lending her presence to projects where her speaking voice could still command attention. Millions of younger fans came to know her not as Maria or Mary Poppins, but as the regal narrator in films like Enchanted and The Princess Diaries. Even when the world could no longer hear her sing, it could still feel her presence, unmistakable in its dignity and charm. But resilience does not erase grief. For Julie, every achievement in later years was shadowed by the knowledge of what had been lost. She once admitted that she still dreamed of singing, still felt melodies in her mind that her body could no longer deliver. For fans, the tragedy was symbolic. The woman who gave the world some of its most treasured songs was left unable to sing them herself. It was as though a painter had been robbed of sight, or a dancer of movement. Her legacy, then, is complicated. On one hand, she remains a living legend. Her films continue to inspire, her books continue to delight, and her public appearances are greeted with reverence. On the other hand, her story is also one of loss, a reminder that even those who seem untouchable can be struck by cruel fate. For admirers, it is bittersweet to celebrate her, while knowing how much she endured. At 90, Julie Andrews represents more than the triumph of a Hollywood star. She represents endurance, grace, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let tragedy define her. Her career stands as proof of extraordinary talent. Her personal life stands as proof of extraordinary resilience. Together they create a portrait not of perfection, but of humanity. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate. Because Julie Andrews was never just a character on a screen or a voice in a song, she was, and remains, a woman who lived through joy and heartbreak, who gave everything she had to her art and her family, and who, even when broken, chose to keep going. Her tragedy is heartbreaking, but her strength is unforgettable. Julie Andrews' journey is often remembered for its sparkle. Mary Poppins with her magic umbrella, Maria von Trapp spinning across the hills, the crystalline soprano that seemed eternal. But behind the timeless image is a story far more complex, one that blends triumph with deep tragedy. She rose higher than almost any performer of her generation, only to lose the very gift that had carried her there. She built a family filled with love, only to endure the struggles of illness, adoption challenges, and the grief of losing her husband after more than 40 years together. For her fans, the heartbreak lies in contrast. The woman who gave the world such joy lived through a private pain that few could see. The woman who embodied music itself was left without a song, and yet she never let tragedy silence her spirit. She reinvented herself, writing, narrating, and mentoring. She chose to carry on, not as a victim of fate, but as a symbol of grace in the face of loss. At 90, Julie Andrews stands as both an icon and a reminder. Her films endure, her legacy shines, but her story also whispers of how fragile even the brightest gifts can be. It is a story that asks us to see beyond the applause and the perfection, to recognize the human cost of fame, love, and loss. The tragedy of Julie Andrews is heartbreaking, but it is also deeply human, and in the quiet resilience she has shown, fans find not just sorrow but inspiration. Her voice may be gone, but her legacy still sings. For more emotional stories, check out this video.